Welcome to yet another opportunity to be able to learn more about the application of the cost of land and wetland degradation tool. In this lesson, we are going to look at the introduction to the Colway tool and understand what it entails. The Colway tool is intended for valuation modeling purposes as an essential step in an active socioeconomic valuation decision-making process. The development of the Colway tool adopted the ecosystem service concept, as was explained, which views the values of degraded lands and wetlands from the perspective of ecosystem functions, which emanates from ecosystem potential to supply a range of goods and services that are fundamental to human beings. And one of the things that I've reiterated in this particular training is that we cannot be able to sustainably take care of what we don't value. And this particular tool enables us to look at natural resources from the point of the value they bring unto us, so that we can be able to establish the monetary value and be able to sit in policy decision-making tables and be able to overturn decisions that are likely to increase degradation of our natural resources or ecosystems. So basically, this tool is a practical guidance on how to assess, monitor, value terrestrial and wetland ecosystems at the site scale for degraded ecosystems. This has to be done at a particular level. And the following ecosystem services have been factored in this tool. We have the provisioning ecosystem services. Under this, we have the wood-based energy and timber products, where we have terrestrial ecosystems such as forests, whether managed by the government or managed by the community, or whether they exist naturally. One can be able to establish the wood-based and timber products. Number two, we have the wetland products, and under wetland products, we have quite a number. We have the plant-based non-wood products. Examples of these are reeds, and such can be valued based on the products that are coming out of them, such as reeds harvested for making mats and baskets. We have wood-based, which is also similar to the wood-based energy and timber products. This is especially for any vegetation that is growing along the wetland ecosystem and can be used for the harvest of timber. Examples of these are mangroves that you find along the Indian Ocean. We have animal products, and this is obvious, the fish that we get from the wetlands. We have other non-animal wetland products, where we have people harvesting sand in places that are closer to wetlands. We have collection of stones for artifacts and things like that. Number three, we have water storage. Most of our wetland ecosystems are able to supply water for domestic use, for livestock, for irrigation, and therefore we can be able to value them based on that. The other set of ecosystem services is the regulating ecosystem services. And number four, here we have climate change mitigation, which is carbon sequestration. One is able to calculate the amount of carbon sequestered and how this is used for climate mitigation. We have flood control, and this is enabled by wetlands, where the existence of a wetland, either naturally or man-made, in a certain ecosystem is able to slow down the movement of water, and this is able to reduce the effects of floods either in an urban ecosystem or in any farmlands or any other valuable ecosystem that is downstream. Number six, we have the wastewater treatment and purification. This is also another service that is done by the wetland ecosystem. You realize under this there are some countries like Uganda, I believe the Kansanga wetland, that is used in wastewater treatment and purification. In this case, we are able to value this wetland contribution through the cost that would have been incurred by the government in actually initiating the wastewater treatment and purification rather than use of the wetland. And if the wetland is degraded and no longer able to do this particular service, then the cost of actually treating that water that was being taken care of by the wetland is what would give us the value of that wetland when it comes to wastewater treatment and purification. Then number seven, we have biodiversity and habitat conservation. And then number eight, we have the soil erosion control. And this is done by either a terrestrial ecosystem that is able to slow down the movement of water, or any other managed ecosystems such as agriculture, where you grow crops and actually ensure soil erosion control. Our third service is actually the cultural ecosystem service, and under this we have the recreational and education. This is where we value the investment that an individual or an institution would make in visiting recreational sites just for the purposes of sentimental value, and that cost is accrued to the particular ecosystem that was being visited. In the Codwell tool, we have technical considerations. And number one is that the tool is designed as a raster input platform that uses different scientific factors and statistical values to execute the socioeconomic valuation. Number two is that the statistical data sources must be those acceptable to the target audience, in that verifiable statistical sources that reflect the country's indicative figures. You must be able to get your statistical data from reliable sources such as government or any other institutions that has been given the mandate to collect the statistical data on behalf of a particular country. Number three is that the economic data input requirements for this model are based on the prevailing prices of the products in question, generated in various units and quantified for a particular time, in this case annually. What you're trying to say is that we normally prefer to advise that you undertake the socioeconomic valuation based on an annual year, and that the economic data that is being used should be for that prevailing period, because they normally shift from one period to another. The value in terms of, number four, the value in terms of the cost can be set to any currency if you want to use a local currency or you want to use the dollar. So who are the target users of Colwet? We are looking at policymakers at both regional and national level, interested in estimating the value of degraded ecosystems under their jurisdiction and taking account of value in policy formulation and investment decisions. Why are we targeting the policymakers? Because they're the same people that make key policy decisions that could lead also to the degradation of particular ecosystems. They're also the same key decision makers that would provide the revenue that is required to restore either degraded ecosystems or also to conserve systems that are likely to be degraded in the near future. Number two, we are looking at decision makers at local and regional level, looking to ensure that the best decisions are made in the light of evidence-based platforms for decision making. There are times when institutions would demand higher revenues to protect certain natural ecosystems, and yet the decision makers, either locally or regional, cannot be able to understand why those high levels of revenues are required. But when you are able to undertake a socioeconomic valuation of a particular ecosystem, say Mau Forest or say the mangroves along the Indian Ocean, you can be able to table this to the decision makers and be able to see the value that we are likely to lose if we change this particular ecosystem into something else, or how this is likely to impact the community that is relying on these particular ecosystems. Then number three, we are targeting the environmental science and environmental economics practitioners involved in the management of ecosystems, and we wish to tell them that this is one of the tools they can use to demonstrate and manage the values of the sites for which they are responsible for. They can also be able to use this kind of tool to generate reports that will be able to present to donors for funding so that they can be able to enhance their work of management of ecosystems. Number four, we are looking at community organizations. We are looking at non-government organizations, the private sector, the scientific community, and other parties interested in understanding and demonstrating and communicating the full picture of the value of ecosystem. Like I said when we started this training, it is very difficult to take care of that which you do not know its value. So what are the data preparation aspects that are required? First of all, we have the biophysical quantification and modeling. Important factors to consider when preparing spatial data are: define an assessment site. You must have an area that you wish to undertake the ecosystem valuation. And then you are able to do your data collection, which will be vector data sets defining the landscape or ecosystem in question. You must understand that all required vector data should be in standard vector format of shapefile. All required raster data should be in standard image file format. For those that understand GIS and remote sensing are able to know what we are talking about. All required files in table format should be a CSV file. The spatial data should be of the same spatial reference, in that the same projected coordinate system with linear map units. Why linear mapping units? It's because this is a valuation exercise and you'd want particularly to understand the area. Probably the area is being used to calculate one of the biophysical factors. The data should be of the same spatial resolution. The data should be of the same spectral resolution, you understand, so that you do not end up having different spatial resolutions or spectral resolution that may affect the output that you intend to get from these tools. The data should be of the same radiometric resolution, bit depth, the unit of representation for each requisite datasets, the raster, the vector, or numeric has been outlined in the guideline for this model. For the economic data, one must understand that existing research or statistical data relevant for the study, such as government reports, can be used. Missing information can be collected through surveys, such as income and costs. Important factors to consider when you're looking at economic data are the value in terms of cost can be set to any currency, and the currency chosen must be consistent while running the individual models for a specific site, because at the end of the day, you'll be able to sum up all the values. The economic data input requirements should be based on the prevailing prices of the products in question. That is where we say look at the economic data inputs in terms of annually what has been happening during that time and be able to get prevailing prices that work. That's why socioeconomic valuation is an annual thing that has to be done annually so that we can be able to collect the correct prices for that economic period. Where applicable, if the harvesting period or cultivated period for a particular product is longer or shorter than 1 year, the annual mean income and cost is used for the calculation. When they're collecting price and cost information through interviews and questionnaires, the mean value of the answers need to be used. This is because different individuals will give you different costs, and then you need to be able to get the mean value across the various people that you interviewed. The evaluation methods do not reflect the sustainability of the current activities. It is also important to the local unit and the relevant unit to be clearly defined. Lastly, majority of the collected information about changes of harvested or cultivated volumes or the time of harvesting, the time spent harvesting or cultivating during recent decades have been used to understand whether unsustainability might be a problem. When it comes to the Colwell tool installation, I believe you've been able to download the tool from the repository. And once you download it, you should be able to unzip the folder. And once you unzip the folder, you install the Colwell. And in your start button inside your computer, you should be able to see the second black picture. You should be able to see all the Colwell models that are part of the Colwell installer. And so we will start with our first model, which is a very easy and direct model known as the Biodiversity and Habitat Conservation Model. As we understand, conservation of biodiversity is protection, upliftment, and scientific management of biodiversity so as to be able to maintain its threshold and derive sustainable benefits for the present and future generations. Habitat conservation is a management practice that seeks to conserve, protect, and restore habitats and prevent species extinction, fragmentation, or reduction in range, and in the same case also avoid the rise of invasive species. So what are the ecosystem service indicators for quantification? We have two: the biophysical assessment, where we look at the diversity of the environmental attributes. This is usually mapped indirectly for the value attached to the environmental attributes by the ecosystem beneficiaries. Number two, we have the ecosystem assessment, where the evaluation of the ecosystem service is a function of expenditure for conservation, and two approaches can be used: the revealed price or the willingness to pay by beneficiaries. What do we mean by that? In this case, we are putting the value of biodiversity and habitat conservation to the amount of money the government is willing to spend to conserve a particular ecosystem, be it a wetland, be it a forest. Alternatively, we are also looking at the amount of money that maybe a local community is willing to contribute to protect or conserve a particular ecosystem service, be it a forest or be it a wetland, because it has sentimental value to that particular community. Under the biodiversity and habitat conservation model, we have three ecosystems that we look at. Number one is the forest, number two is the wetland, number three is the rangeland, and then the summation tab is able to bring the forest, wetland, and rangeland ecosystems together if they are found within the same geographical location. So what are the data requirements for this particular model? Number one, we have the land use land cover that defines the various ecosystem types. Number two, Number 2, we have the money set aside for conservation per unit area, either by the government or any organization that has been given the mandate to be able to conserve a particular ecosystem. The money set aside should be converted and harmonized to reflect cash set aside per meter squared as the standard unit. Number 4, feature area data, area of land use ecosystem and assessment in meter squared. The pixel area of the input rasters should be meter squared. And now let us go to the model demonstration, and we'll be able to visualize the output of our products in either any GIS software, either QGIS or ArcGIS. So when you open the biodiversity and habitat conservation model on your screen, you should be able to see this kind of a model where it's written forest, wetland, rangelands, and summation tab. And then you have the input raster for land cover, just like I've described the data requirements in the previous session. So in this input raster for forest land cover, that is where we'll browse in the folder where you have designated the data inputs for running this model. And then the next thing is to be able to put the forest area. Where do you get that data? From the shapefile that designates the forest area. And then the input raster pixel area, it comes from the type of data that you're using. If it is Sentinel, it's 10 meters. If it is Landsat, it's 30 meters. So for you to get the area, is the 30 meter by 30 meter, that gives you 900. If it is Sentinel, it's 10 by 10. So we move and browse to get the data, the input data for the biodiversity and conservation model. For my case, I've saved my data sets under the color development, online training folder. Then we have the training data, and there's a folder designated as biodiversity and conservation. Inside that, we have 3 types of data sets, one for the forest, one for the wetland, and one for the rangeland. We'll work with the LULUCF for the land use land cover for forest, that is Kariba. Kariba is an area in Zimbabwe. So we'll use that data to be able to assign values, the biodiversity and habitat conservation model. Remember, I said that it is mapped indirectly, that the biophysical indicators for this are assigned indirectly because it is not mappable. Like there's no biophysical indicator process that can be run to get the attributes or the benefits that come as a result of biodiversity and habitat conservation. From a previous slides, I said that the price that we use for the valuation is the revealed price. If the funding is from government or any institution that is funding for the habitat conservation. If it is the local community that is conserving this particular habitat or biodiversity, then we call it the willingness to pay price. And so that is the value that we assign. The old values would mean the value for that land use land cover. The new values now become the value or the monetary value or the economic value that tells us this is the much this community or this organization is willing to spend for the biodiversity and habitat conservation. So in this case, let's say we are working with Kariba Forest and the government or institution is willing to spend $10 million to be able to preserve or conserve Kariba Forest. So $10 million, for example. The forest area for Kariba has been calculated and you can get it from the shapefile data. If you check the shapefile data, for this case, we have 111, 654, 42 meters squared. And then we have the pixel area. This is a Landsat data. So it's a 30 by 30, which is 900. And then we browse to the output folder where we intend to have our outputs, because in GIS, you must always have an input folder and you must always have an output folder where you save your files. So under the training data folder, I have my output folder, which I select there. For these particular models, the designated name has already been done behind the model. So you don't need to sit and wonder what name we'll use. It will automatically have a name that we have designated. And so once all the data sets have been put, then we are ready to run the model. So the model has finished. the biodiversity and habitat conservation, it should give you that message that it has finished successfully, and you say okay. And then we are able now to move to visualize in QGIS or ArcGIS or any other GIS software that you may have to see what kind of product you are getting and whether there's any information that we can get from that product that we have generated. Are we getting a value of biodiversity and habitat conservation from that forest? We open our QGIS software so that we can be able to load the data sets that we have been able to generate from the model. So I'll go to layer, add the raster data. Remember, we said most of our data inputs are rasters, so the outputs definitely would be raster datasets. So I'll browse to the folder where I have my output file, training data output. So there's a file there that says conservation value raster for forest. We load this particular raster datasets. So here we have, we can try and give it color. So here we have the conservation value raster for forest, giving us a value of $80 per pixel within this landscape. You can be able to give it a different color if you're familiar with QGIS. And since it's only one value, what we are trying to say that for every pixel representing a forest here, the government or private sector institution for a 30 by 30 meter level, it's willing to spend $80. Why are we representing our figures per pixel? Because at the end of the day, we'll be able to sum up different products of forest so that we can be able to have that per pixel value. But then again, if you want converted to a landscape level for the purposes of visualization, that you can also be able to do using a GIS software. So that is our product. We've been able to generate a product. It depends on the true value. The value that you get there of $80 will depend on the input value that you have been given. So the values that we use were just for the purposes of demonstration. And there we have our product. It's ready. You can be able to generate it, visualize it, do some cartographical work on it so that it's ready for visualization. Thank you.